Hey everyone, Nick here from Talking Cardboard, and today I'll be talking about the board game, The Fires of Midway. Published by Clash of Clans Games in 2010. This is a 1 to 4 player card-driven game that simulates the carrier combat during the Pacific theater of World War II, pitting the Japanese against the Americans. This game is designed by Steve Cunliffe, and I would say plays in about 2 hours. And although there's different scenarios that may take longer or shorter time than that. And I do want to point out, before I go any further, that you might be wondering, is this really the box the game comes in? And maybe on video it doesn't look so bad. But this was actually the box the game was mailed in. But actually, if you buy the game direct from the publisher, it does come in this plastic bag. The first print run of this game, I think, was in a box version. It was a box version, but for the second printing, the publisher decided just to do plastic bag versions. And for you non-war gamers, this might seem like ridiculous that a game actually ships in a plastic baggie, but for us war gamers out there, we know that this is something that isn't unheard of. So just keep that in mind. If you order this game online and it comes in a plastic baggie, don't freak out. That's the way it's supposed to come. Obviously, it saves money, I'm sure, for the publisher to ship a game that way. So with that said, I first want to talk about how this game plays and give you a high-level overview of what a round of the game looks like. And then I'll wrap up with my final thoughts on how this and what I think of this game. So without further ado, let's learn to play The Fires of Midway. So here we have a game of Fires of Midway set up and ready to play. First thing you need to do when playing a game is pick a scenario you want to play through. Technically, you could just make up your own scenario and choose your own carriers and aircraft that you want to play with. But the game does come with 4 historical scenarios as well as some alternate history scenarios that might be fun to play with. After you pick the scenario, then you know which carriers and airplanes you're supposed to use, as well as any other special rules that are relevant for that scenario. So the game setup is divided into 3 lines. We have a Japanese fleet line, an ocean line, and then the American fleet line. Looking more closely at the Japanese fleet line, we have the Japanese command mat, which is where the Japanese player will keep track of their victory points, as well as house their action cards. And then also there's a bunch of references to iconography and sequence of play that the player will find helpful. Next to that, we have the Japanese carriers and airplanes that, again, will be called out in the scenario setup instructions. And then finally, the Japanese admiral card. Next, we have this ocean line area, and in the middle of the ocean line is a 5x6 grid of what are called search and destroy cards. This 5x6 grid is only used in the very first part of the game, and then once called the search phase, and once that phase is over, all these search and destroy cards will then get shuffled into a deck and be placed on this staging mat over here. Also on the staging mat then is a location for the action initiative cards as well as areas for destroyed American and Japanese cards called the Watery Grave. And then finally we have the maneuver map, which is where players will keep track of the location of their carriers throughout the course of a game. And then we also end with we have the American fleet line down here, which is identical to the Japanese fleet line in terms of functionality. Of course, the American player is going to have different carriers and air wings at their disposal and a different admiral card, but their command mat is essentially identical to the Japanese players, and simply again serves as a way to track victory points as well as house the action cards. So that's set up for Fires of Midway. Let's talk about how you actually play this game. Alright, now that setup is complete, we're finally ready to launch our attack groups at the opposing carriers. Not so fast, sailor. Before we can do that, we need to know where the enemy carriers are, and to do that, we must complete the search phase. In the search phase, there's 3 parts. The first part is the search grid. During the search grid part of the search phase, opposing players take turns drawing 2 cards from the search grid, looking at both cards secretly, putting one back face down into the search grid, and the other card face up back onto the search grid. For the face-up card, the revealing player now gets to resolve the effect that is listed on the left side of the Search and Destroy card that they just revealed. These effects range from Empty Ocean, which simply means no effect happens, Low Cloud, which allows the revealing player to place a cloud token on the maneuver board, Squall, which allows the player to place a squall token on the maneuver board, Wake Spotted, and Escort Spotted, which allows the revealing player to draw cards into their action cards into their hand, Ready Cap, which allows the revealing player to ready a cap for any of their carriers, and then finally Enemy Fleet, which allows the revealing player to draw 3 action cards. Once the third Enemy Fleet Search and Destroy card is revealed, that revealing player gets to draw their 3 action cards, and the search grid part of the search phase is now over, and you move into the gaining victory point phase. During the gain victory points, the player that revealed the last fleet card now receives 2 victory points, which is noted with their victory point marker on their player mat, and also flips their victory point marker to the confident side to denote that they are now the confident player. This means that their maximum hand size when drawing cards into their hand is 7. The other player now receives 1 victory point and must flip their victory point marker to the desperate side. The desperate player now has a hand limit of 9 cards when choosing to do a draw action later in the game. After the gain victory point part of the search phase, we now move on into the mobilized fleet, which is when players now place their carriers where they would like to on the maneuver board. The confident player places their carriers first, and the only restrictions are that you must place your carriers into your starting areas of the maneuver board, and also you can have no more than 2 carriers together in one area, which the game calls a task force, but the task force itself doesn't have any actual meaning in the game. It simply just is a way to call an area that has 2 carriers together. And after placing your carriers onto the maneuver board, you're now done with the search phase. Alright, now that you've located those enemy carriers during the search phase, you're ready to move on to the strategy phase. But before you can begin the strategy phase, you'll first want to clear up all those search and destroy cards that were used in the search grid. Take all the search and destroy cards and place them on the search and destroy deck location of the staging mat, and from here on out, these search and destroy cards will be used to assess the fuel consumption of your attack groups, as well as to determine the damage that carriers receive during torpedo and bomber attacks. There's 3 parts to the strategy phase. The first is dealing out the action cards. Now, action cards, I would say, are really just initiative cards and will be used to determine the order of play of the carriers that are in the game. So the number of action cards you deal out will simply be the number of carriers that are currently active in the game. So in the case of having 4 carriers active, you would deal out 4 action cards, starting with 1 and going down. Now, after the action cards are dealt out, you move on to pressing the advantage. And during the pressing the advantage part of the strategy phase, the confident player has the opportunity to swap out one of their action cards with one from any of their carriers with 1 action card of any of their opponent's carriers. They don't have to do this, but they have this option. And then finally, the last part of the strategy phase is maneuvering your forces. Starting with the confident player, carrier tokens on the maneuver board are moved up to 1 adjacent space from their current location, with the same restrictions still applicable, that being that you can only have a maximum of 2 carrier tokens in one area at a time. Also, if moving your carrier tokens, you must make sure that you flip them to their hidden side if they're not already on their hidden side. And once the confident player finished with their movement, then the desperate player takes their turn in moving their carrier tokens on the maneuver board. And after that, you have completed the strategy phase. Alright, after completing that strategy phase, we're now ready to move on to the fun part of the game, the carrier turns. During the carrier turns, players will alternate taking carrier actions based on the priority of each of their carriers, which was designated by the action cards they just received for each carrier, starting with number 1. Now, during carrier turn, there's several phases to go through, but before those phases begin, you first need to decide what carrier action you would want to take. Every carrier turn has the same 3 actions available, which are also listed on the action card. There's Into the Wind, Battle Stations, and Save the Ship. Each of these actions provides the carrier with slightly different opportunities. So with the Into the Wind action, the number in the upper right corner is the number of aircraft that can be sent out into an attack group. But the symbology in the lower left designates you can't take this action if you currently have a fire on board your carrier, which hopefully isn't the case at the start of the game. For battle stations, the number in the upper right again designates the number of aircraft you can send out into a strike group, and the number in the lower left is the number of repair points you would receive for this action. And then finally, Save the Ship wouldn't allow you to send out any planes in a strike group. However, the symbol in the upper right designates you're able to draw 2 cards into your hand, and the number in the lower left allows you to use that number of repair points to repair your ship. So this is definitely a defensive action and should only be taken if your carrier is close to being sunk. Now, if you choose an action that allows you to send planes out either into the wind or battle stations, you now would take time to put together your strike group. The only requirements of the strike group is that it contains at least 1 bomber plane or torpedo plane, which also I think is common sense, since the point of a strike group is to inflict damage on an enemy carrier. Also, you have an option to including an escort fighter, which is usually recommended to protect the bombers and torpedoes you're sending out, but that's up to the player. Also, of course, you have to follow the limits of aircraft you can send out based on the action you took. You can't send more than what the action allows you to send out. But other than that, there's no other restrictions on what kind of planes you're sending out. And once you've chosen those planes, you'd move on to the sortie phase. If you picked an action that allows you to use repair points, you now can spend those repair points however you see fit. There's multiple things that you can use repair points for which have different costs. For example, you can reduce an inferno counter by flipping it, which costs 2 repair points. You can spend a repair point to remove a fire counter. You can spend 3 repair points to patch a flood counter. You can spend 2 repair points to fix a leak counter. You can also spend 3 repair points to return a plane from the watery grave and place it back into its corresponding carrier. And then finally, you can spend 5 carrier points to move a bulkhead counter left 1 box on the hull track. Once you've either used your airplane points to put together a strike group and or used your repair points, you would move on to the sortie phase, assuming you did put together a strike group. Because if you did that Save the Ship action, you actually would not have any aircraft right now to use for the sortie phase, and actually you would go straight to the Admiral phase. If you chose either Into the Wind or Battle Stations for your carrier action and launched a strike group into the air, you'll now move on to the sortie phase. During the sortie phase, you'll determine how well your strike group does in locating the enemy carrier. First, you total up the distance that your strike group has to travel. That distance is the number of spaces away from your carrier, plus any clouds, plus 1 for every clouds that you have to fly through, and then finally adding 1 if the enemy carrier you're targeting is still hidden, which is represented by the +1 side of the enemy carrier counter. That total now becomes the total distance traveled. That number now dictates how many search and destroy cards you have to draw to determine if the fuel consumption that your planes had to use in order to reach the enemy carrier. Draw the number of search and destroy cards needed to match the distance traveled. Then look and determine how many fuel cans that were consumed during that trip. If the number of fuel cans is greater than or equal to the fuel value of any of your planes in the strike group, those planes now must flip to their exhausted side, and they simply just will not be as effective as they were previously. But if your planes have a fuel rating greater than the number of fuel cans you just counted up, you're good to go, and those planes will reach the enemy carrier fresh. After determining which of your planes potentially are exhausted from the trip to reach the enemy carrier, you now flip the enemy carrier token over to its revealed side on the maneuver board if it was not already revealed. Finally, the enemy carriers have a chance for a spotting roll. Spotting roll basically gives them a chance to prepare themselves further for the oncoming attack. Spotting roll is simply rolling a die, and if the value of the die is less than or equal to the number of planes in the strike group, the enemy carrier has spotted your strike group and now has the opportunity to either put one cap in the air if they have the ability to do so, or draw 2 cards. If their spotting roll is higher than the number of planes in your strike group, they unfortunately don't get to react in any way and will have to suffer the consequences accordingly. Once you're done with that, you've now completed the sortie phase and get to now move on to the engagement phase. Now that you've completed the sortie phase, you'll determine if you will have an engagement phase. If the target area has any carriers with cap in the air or combat air patrol, then you'll have an engagement phase. If the target area has no combat air patrol in the air, then you won't have an engagement phase. If you will have an engagement phase, you need to determine the kind of combat that you'll complete. If the strike group has any fighter escorts with it, then you will complete a dogfight. If the strike group has no fighter escorts with it, then you would resolve a turkey shoot. Whether you're resolving a dogfight or turkey shoot, the combat resolution steps are the same. For aerial combat, players first decide if they want to play a combat card from their hand. The eligible combat cards are the ones with the inside cockpit view picture located on them. And below the cockpit, there's a variety of symbols that determine what that card will do for you. These symbols include a bullseye, with a crosshair on it, which would immediately negate all the symbols on your opponent's played combat card. A combat die, which simply adds dice to your die pool for the upcoming flyer die test. A bullet die, which adds die to your die pool for a potential upcoming damage test. And then a 0 with a red line through it, which would only be on American combat cards. And this eliminates 1 combat die from the die pool for the Japanese player's flyer die test. There's also the opportunity to just play your bluff card. If you want to hold on to your available dogfight cards or simply don't have a dogfight card currently in your hand. Players then simultaneously reveal the combat cards they have chosen and proceed to the flyer die test. During the flyer die test, players count up the total number of die that they're able to roll, which is based on the plane that they currently are using in the current fight, along with dice from any played combat cards. Then both players at the same time roll their total number of dice, and the highest die wins. If there's a tie between both players, the player that rolled the most number of highest die wins the combat. If there's still a tie there, then the player with a field plane wins the combat, opposed to non-field planes. And then if there's still a tie, the cap player wins the combat. After resolving the flyer die test, you now resolve damage. Damage resolution is determined by rolling the number of die based on the number of bullet symbols you have for your plane, along with any combat cards played. That number, you roll that number of die and then simply look at the damage chart of the plane that's being attacked and choose one of the die rolled and resolve its effect on the damage track of the opposing plane. There's 3 potential results that could occur. One is a shield symbol, which simply means the damage unfortunately had no effect The other is a fuel hit, which means the targeted plane now needs to flip to its fuel depleted side. And then finally, the fireball symbol means the plane was successfully destroyed and would now go to the watery grave. After you've resolved the aerial combat, you potentially have other aerial combats to resolve, and if not, then you move on to the bomber phase. If at least one dive bomber or torpedo bomber survived the engagement phase, you now move on to the bomber phase. At the start of the bomber phase, the attacking strike group player chooses one of its bombers to resolve its attack run for, and also designates which carrier it's attacking if there's more than one enemy carrier in the target area. Now you move on to the attack run step, which is handled very similarly to the aerial combat step of the engagement phase. Both players now secretly choose a combat card from their hand. The bomber player can only play a combat card with a fiery outline, whereas the carrier player can only play a combat card with the kind of iron hull material outline. Also, both players could instead just play their bluff card. The icons on the cards are very similar to the icons seen on the aerial combat cards. There's the crosshair symbol, which negates all the icons on the opposing player's card. There's a combat die, which will add dice to your die pool for the upcoming flak dice test. There's the bomb symbol and torpedo symbol, which adds damage dice for the bomber player. There's the bullet symbol, which adds damage dice for the carrier player. And then there's a draw two cards, which allows the player to draw two cards into their hand. Once players have chosen their cards, you move on to the flak dice test. The flak dice test is handled very similarly to how the flyer die test was resolved during the engagement phase. Players now reveal their chosen combat cards and take their allotted number of dice. For the bomber player, that's the number of bomb icons on their bomber card, as well as the number of bomb icons on any played combat action cards. For the carrier player, that's the number of combat dice symbols on its carrier card, as well as any die symbols on played combat cards. Then both players will roll their allotted number of dice simultaneously, with the highest die winning the flak dice test. If there's a tie, then it's the player who rolled the most of the highest die in the flak dice test, and if there's still a tie, then the bomber player wins. If the bomber player won the flak dice test, you move straight to the bombs away step. But if the carrier player won the flak dice test, you now resolve damage to the bomber. The carrier player now takes the number of die equal to number of bullet symbols it has on its carrier card, as well as any bullet symbols on their played combat card. After rolling their allotted die, the carrier player decides, picks one of the die rolled, and resolves its effect based on the damage track on the bomber's card. These possible outcomes are identical to the outcomes of the planes during the engagement phase, but those are shield, which means no damage is done to the bomber, a fuel hit, which flips the bomber to its exhausted smoking side, and then an explosion symbol, which destroys the bomber completely. If the carrier is successful in destroying the bomber, then you don't have a bombs away phase or step, and you would move on to the next bomber or end the bomber phase if there's no more bombers left. Otherwise, if the bomber is still alive, you move on to the bombs away step. For the bombs away step, the bomber player totals up the number of damage dice it's going to roll, which is the number of bomber or torpedo icons on its bomber card, plus any additional bomber or torpedo icons listed on its played combat card. Then the player that won the flak dice test draws 2 search and destroy cards and chooses one card for the damage resolution for the carrier, which is located on the bottom of the search and destroy card. So this of course means if the carrier player won the flak dice test, they're going to choose the search and destroy card with the more advantageous damage track results for them. Likewise, the bomber player is going to take the search and destroy card with a more destructive damage track results. Now the bomber player would roll the number of combat or damage dice it calculated, and references each die result to the damage track of the chosen search and destroy card. There's several different outcomes for each die result. The first is a watery geyser symbol, which means that a flood counter is placed on the enemy carrier and a critical hit is resolved, which pushes the bulkhead counter on the carrier one step to the right. If it's a shield symbol, then no damage is resolved. If there's a fiery blast symbol, then one fire counter is added to the enemy carrier. If there's a fire blast critical hit, not only the enemy carrier receives an inferno counter and also takes a critical hit, which again moves the carrier's bulkhead counter down one on its track. And also, it's important to note that only torpedo planes can inflict water geyser results, and only bomber planes can inflict the fiery blast results. Once damage has been determined, the bomber phase is complete, and you now would move on to the next phase, unless you have an additional bomber to resolve an attack run for, in which case you would repeat these same steps. Now that you've completed the bomber phase, you move on to the resolution phase. First, you need to take care of the cap that were just involved in the combat over the target area. For any cap of a carrier that is currently on its smoking side, it must make an emergency landing back on its carrier and goes back into the air wing of the carrier. If any cap is still on its undamaged side, it now flips to its smoking side to signify that aircraft is now exhausted from the previous round of combat, but is still in the air protecting its aircraft. After resolving the cap, you move on to take care of the returning aircraft of the strike group. For all aircraft in the strike group that are still on their undamaged side, they make it back to their home carrier without any issue. For those aircraft that are now on its smoking side, you're going to have to do a die roll to see if they make it home safely. First, count the number of areas between the carrier that launched the strike group and the area that contained the targeted enemy carrier. Then roll a die for each of the smoking returning aircraft. If the die result is greater than the number of spaces between the carriers, that aircraft makes it home okay. If, however, the die result is equal to or lower than the number of areas between the carrier, that aircraft unfortunately has a trouble making it all the way back to its home carrier and has to ditch into the ocean, sending that plane to the watery grave. Also, if you roll a 1, that aircraft unfortunately makes a crash landing on its home carrier, causing 1 fire token on the carrier, and also still sends it to the watery grave. After you're done with that, you move on to the final phase of the carrier turn, which is the admiral phase. Now that you've completed the resolution phase, you move on to the admiral phase. During the admiral phase, both players, starting with the player who just took their carrier turn, take 1 admiral action. These admiral actions are listed on the backside of each player's admiral card. The first action a player could take is the reload action, which allows a player to discard as many combat cards as they want from their hand and add up to their hand size limit of combat cards. This includes the bluff card, and you need to take into account whether you're the desperate player or confident player, as the maximum hand size differs between the two. The next action is the recover action, which allows you to return any cap that are currently in the air, and it also allows you to launch 1 cap from any carrier you control. And then finally, there's the restore action, which provides the player 3 repair points that can be spent on any carrier they wish. After completing the admiral phase, you move on to the end phase if all carriers have taken their turns. Otherwise, you would repeat all these phases for the remaining carriers that still have yet to take a carrier turn. The last phase of a game turn is the end phase. Players first resolve carrier carnage by looking at their carriers and checking the bulkhead counter to see if it's reached step 3 of the carrier's hull track. If so, that carrier must now flip to its crippled side. All damage counters remain on the carrier, any cap in the air remain in the air, and your opposing player receives 1 victory point for crippling your carrier. After resolving carrier carnage, you now resolve explosion tests. For each damage counter on a carrier, you roll dice. The number of dice rolled for each damage counter is illustrated by the dice images on the counters themselves. For leaks and fires, 1 damage die is rolled. For infernos, 2 damage die are rolled. And for floods, 3 damage die are rolled. After rolling the dice, the value of the dice are compared to the structure rating of the carrier. If the value of the die is greater than or equal to the structure rating, you must move the bulkhead counter 1 space down down the carrier's hull track. You now check the location of the bulkhead counters for each carrier again. If a bulkhead counter is on step 3 of a carrier's hull track, you have to flip that carrier over to its crippled side, providing your opponent victory points. If a bulkhead counter is now on step 6 of a carrier's hull track, that carrier has been sunk. All aircraft in the air wing of that carrier must go to the watery grave, and your opponent receives victory points for destroying your carrier. After resolving the explosion tests, now you determine victory points for aircraft that have been destroyed. For every 7 American aircraft in the watery grave, the Japanese player receives 1 victory point, and for every 5 aircraft in the Japanese watery grave, the American player receives 1 victory point. And then finally, there is a victory point check. If any player has reached or exceeded the intensity level of the scenario in victory points, that player has won. If not, both players will now play another game turn, starting with the strategy phase. Keep in mind that the player with more victory points should have their victory point marker on its confidence side, while the player with less victory points should have their victory point marker on the desperate side, as they are the desperate player. And that's essentially the main rules for the Fires of Midway board game. So what did I think of the Fires of Midway? Well, I'll just say now, I did enjoy this game. But I first want to talk about some of the things that I didn't like so much. Starting with the fact this game does come in a plastic baggie, which I knew that before I purchased the game, that this was a plastic baggie game. And, already I've made my makeshift box to store this game. It's not ideal, but that's just the way it is for this game. Along with that, the component quality in general for this game is lacking. There's nothing exciting about the artwork on these cards. If you haven't noticed already, it's kind of cartoonish in a way. But they throw in like historical photos of things, and part of me appreciates the color that they have for the artwork in this game. A lot of war games are kind of dry and boring to look at, and this game isn't that, but it's almost the opposite end of the spectrum, where it's kind of corny. And if I didn't know anything about this game and saw it on the table, I would think it maybe was like a prototype or like a very early version of a game. Further, the quality of the components, besides the artwork, which I'm not like a huge artwork person in general, but besides the artwork kind of being like I said, almost cartoony, the component quality also just isn't anything exceptional. The quality of these cards is seems on the flimsy side of the spectrum, and all the player mats and the maneuver board are just thin cardboard too. They don't have sturdy cardstock components for anything. The dice are fine. The tokens, I guess, are sufficient. They're larger size tokens, so that's nice. But definitely nothing exciting when it comes to component quality. Also, the second edition, maybe only of this game, print the rules in black and white, which, considering the color actually could help. It could definitely help explain the rules in certain situations. So that was kind of disappointing too, that they had to give you. They decided to go with a black and white rule book. That I don't see at all very much. So except really old games like So that was kind of an interesting decision. Something else that I wasn't so excited about when it comes to the design of this game was the search phase. The search phase seemed kind of almost gimmicky. It seemed like a mini game before you played the real game. It seemed a little out of place. I get the thematic the thematic reasoning for having this in the game. It was supposed to illustrate, of course, the historical cat and mouse searching for each other's carriers in the Pacific, and that was, I'm sure, a big part of carrier warfare was simply just locating where in this huge ocean the enemy fleet was located. But thematically, the connection really isn't there when you're doing the search phase, because it's like a game of memory. You're just flipping cards and picking one, and then it's like a draft almost, a mini draft between you and your opponent, and trying to best put yourself in the best position when you actually start the real game. But in my opinion, I honestly would prefer just an alternate rule set, or an alternative kind of game start that just says each player receives this many action cards, and you get one squall token each to place on the maneuver map, one low cloud marker to place on the maneuver map, start the game. Going through this whole search phase didn't really seem that interesting, and was almost felt like a hassle. But it is what it is. So with that said, things that I liked about this game. First of all, it is extremely thematic. You do feel like you're a admiral in the Pacific Theater, and even without my admiral cap, I would still say the same. But nonetheless, you feel like you're making important decisions that are going to be real impactful, and you feel like you're making the exact same kinds of decisions the admirals during the actual that were actually manning these carrier fleets had to make, such as when to launch your strike groups, when to hold them back and focus on repairing your aircraft carrier, whether you should keep your carriers grouped together or keep them separated out, how you should maneuver yourself around the maneuver board, whether you feel you need to put a cap in the air or not. And I appreciate the simplicity of the design. You don't have to worry about making tons of different decisions. When you're making your carrier actions, there's only 3 to choose from: Into the Wind, Battle Stations, and Save the Ship. So not a lot of thinking that bogs down the gameplay that can definitely cause you to lose interest in other war games when there's a lot of analysis paralysis that's going on. And in this game, there's really not even opportunity to have a lot of analysis paralysis, because the decisions are pretty straightforward. And besides then the carrier turn actions, you have your the various fleet actions or admiral actions at the end of the turn, the reload, recover, and restore actions. Again, just 3 simple actions to choose from. But the decision you make is really important. And when it comes to initiative, I really like that aspect of the game. Do you even want to go first? Maybe you have the opportunity as that confident player to always get that first initiative card for one of your carriers, but maybe you just want your opponent to keep that card so that and force them to go first to see what they do, and then react accordingly. So there's just all these decisions going on that really make this game engaging. I really appreciate the whole putting your aircraft together in a strike group, and you feel that's an important decision. Even do you bring a fighter escort or not? Like, maybe you think you take your chances, and that carrier doesn't have an escort in the air. I'm going to hope that they don't get one in the air, and that I'm able just to maximize the damage to that carrier by bringing 3 bombers instead of just 2 bombers and 1 fighter. These are decisions I'm sure these admirals had to make during the Pacific War too. The combat resolution system, I really appreciate that. It's really fast. It's quick moving, but it still feels like you're getting that good dogfighting in. And the action card play makes the game interesting, right? Like, you might have the better plane, but your opponent might have the better action card, and to keep things interesting, So I like that part of the game. How bombing runs are conducted, I appreciate that resolution system, and how damage is resolved. Like all the mechanics of how this game plays, I enjoy and I appreciate, and how the carriers themselves finally get damaged, and how bombing does fire and inferno damage, which isn't quite as impactful as flooding damage that torpedo planes incur, but when those torpedoes hit and cause a flood, it's an automatic critical hit, and it's 3 dice of damage, and it's more repair points to repair than the inferno and fire tokens. So there's this kind of balancing act between the types of damage these carriers can take. I appreciate how the bulkhead counters keep track of the damage on the carriers, and how the carriers flip to their crippled side. And I appreciate too the whole the asymmetry of this game. Of course, I think the design does a good job of kind of illustrating the high level strengths of each side. The fact that the Japanese planes have better fuel consumption or better range on the maneuver board, and also the Zeros are have stronger fighters. They have better dice when doing the flyer die test, and meanwhile the Americans have better radar. You get to do that reroll of when you're spotting an incoming strike group, which can be the difference between having a cap in the air or not, which is really big. And also they get to re-roll explosion tests for explosion dice results for their carriers, which is also can be a really big deal in whether a carrier is sunk or not. So I appreciate how those historical asymmetric differences are simulated in this board game. And in terms of gameplay and replayability, I've obviously just played this the one time. I've only played this game now one time with my dad, and I would definitely be fine playing that one scenario again, just the way it was. So I think that's telling that just the one scenario I would find interesting to replay. But there's 4 historical scenarios that come with this game. Definitely would like to try out the other 3. What I'm not 100% sure of is if those scenarios will feel very different from one another. I kind of wonder if they'll almost feel samey. I kind of wonder do I feel it's much of a different game having 3 carriers opposed to 4 carriers opposed to 2 carriers. But until I've actually tried playing with more carriers and a slightly different scenario, I can't really speak to that. So definitely makes me want to try the different scenarios that this game comes with, and of course playing with the Midway and Wake Island on the board, and then they have the non-historical scenarios which look fun to play just for fun, and then they have the Nimitz carrier in this game, which is a carrier with like fighter jets, which sounds kind of fun, and they have a non-historic scenario for that. And also there's the solitaire rules set in this game that I've yet to try. Definitely a big part of the reason why this game interested me is that they had that solitaire rule set, and from what I can see, the solitaire rules are pretty thorough, so that's great. Something I never really touched on significantly in the gameplay, or when I gave the rules instructions, was that these admirals have what are called their admiral doctrine, and each admiral, there's 2 admirals on each side. Each admiral has slightly different admiral doctrine, and essentially when the player is the confident player, they have to adhere to their admiral doctrine. So for example, Admiral Fletcher says that you have to have a torpedo plane in your strike group whenever you're sending out a strike group at a enemy carrier. And more often than not, maybe that's not an issue at all. You always have a torpedo ready to go, but sometimes maybe that's not the case. So these admiral doctrines are just kind of a fun additional, way to add another level of variety in the game. And don't know how historical these are. Like if, for example, with Admiral Fletcher, if he was obsessed with torpedo planes or something, I would like to think there's a historical relevance to that, but nonetheless, another thing that they add to the game. And the iconography and the symbology of this game, I did earlier say I'm not a big fan of the artwork and the aesthetics of this game. But the one thing that I do want to point out that I think they did well is the simplicity of the iconography on all the action cards. Okay, if a die means you roll another die for this combat test check, and the symbol of a bomb or torpedo means you're rolling another die for damage for bombing or torpedo when you're doing your bombing run. So the symbol, and then on the damage counters themselves, those are easy to keep track of because, during the explosion test for a fire damage counter, you rolls one die because it says so. On the victory point tokens, it helps you keep track of how many cards you can have in your hands. So I do appreciate that the iconography is simple to understand. So that's Fires of Midway. Overall, definitely have to recommend this game for any wargamer out there. Obviously, for any wargamer specifically interested in the Pacific theater of World War II and carrier combat, this game, I do think, probably does simulates carrier combat in the most efficient way possible. Yeah, you might be asking, or you may have been wondering, there's no other ships in the game. There's battleships. Battleships, destroyers, cruisers. And the design. There's a designer notes at the beginning of the rulebook that do explain the reason for that is because they didn't really apparently have a big involvement in carrier battles. Like, they were there, they were around the carriers and protecting the carriers from enemy ships, but at the end of the day, it was just the carriers, going mano a mano, sending planes out at the opposing carrier and vice versa, because the biggest target was always the carrier on each side. So those ships apparently didn't have a lot of impact in the battles, and therefore, by excluding them from this game, you're not actually historically ruining the experience of the carrier battles themselves. And I think that's interesting. I'm not a military expert by any means, so if maybe other historians or military experts watching this would say, well, that's not very true. But like I said, that just comes from the designer notes, and to me that kind of makes sense, I guess. And yeah, maybe it's a little disappointing that you don't have other ships that you really get to play with, but it's fine because then it streamlines this game. And what I was going to say next is it's great for a wargamer, but even for someone who isn't necessarily that much into war games, this I would consider kind of on that entry level difficulty setting. There's not a lot of rules in this game. I played this with my dad, who definitely isn't into any kind of complicated games. His, probably the most complicated game I probably had him play with me before this was Memoir 44, and he seemed to pick up this game after the one gameplay we had. So I think that this game is great for those that aren't typically just looking for war games, and so that's another reason why I would recommend looking into this game too, from that standpoint, that it's a simple enough game that you don't have to be someone who's only into war games to enjoy this. So with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video. Obviously, any questions or comments, please put them below the video in the comments section. I definitely look forward to seeing what you guys thought of the game, or if there's any questions you have about how this game plays. I definitely did leave out some rules here and there to kind of keep this video as streamlined as possible. But with that said, please like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and I look forward to seeing you guys again soon. Thanks, guys.